February of 2023. Snow sat heavy on the branches of the old oak tree. It covered the roof of the barn. A barn built in 1922 by a man named Samuel Hawthorne. Inside, the air was cold. It smelled of oil and old wood and frozen earth. Clara Hawthorne stood beside the tractor. Her breath plumed in the quiet air. The tractor was an Alice Chalmers Model WC, year of manufacture 1947. The orange paint was faded to a pale, flat salmon. Rust bloomed on the edges of the fenders. The seat was cracked black leather, stuffing showing through. A man named Dr. Alistair Finch stood beside her. He was from the State Agricultural Museum. He ran a gloved hand along the engine housing. Alistair spoke softly. His voice was full of reverence, a perfectly preserved example of post-war ingenuity. Clara nodded. She watched him. He moved around the machine slowly. He took notes on a small pad. He stopped at the toolbox. The small rectangular steel box mounted just behind the seat. He frowned. He leaned in closer. "That's peculiar," he said. He tapped it with his knuckle, a dull, solid thud. "The lid," he said. "The seam. It's been welded shut." Clara looked at the thin, neat bead of metal, a silver scar running the length of the lid. "Yes," she said. "My grandfather did that. He did it in the fall of 1958. Alistair Finch straightened up. He looked from the welded box to Clara. Why would he do that? Clara pointed to a long trestle table set up nearby. On it were ledgers, dozens of them, bound in dark green and black, years stamped on the spine in gold leaf. 1958, 1959, 1960, all the way to the present day. Alistair walked over. He opened the ledger for 1958. The pages were filled with elegant looping cursive, her grandfather's hand. Arthur Hawthorne. Alistair traced a line of figures with his finger. Input costs, seed, fuel, fertilizer, then net profit. He flipped a few pages. He opened the 1965 ledger, then 1975, then 1988. His eyes scanned the columns. He saw acreage bought. He saw yields per acre. He saw profits rise, steady as a heartbeat. But he saw something missing, a specific line item, a cost that every other farm in the county carried. He looked up at Clara. His face was a mask of confusion. Then, dawning realization. "There's no debt," he said. "Not a single loan, no equipment financing, no operating line of credit, no mortgage payments listed for any of the land purchases." Clara said nothing. She just watched him. He looked back at the ledgers. Then he looked at the old tractor, at the toolbox, welded shut. The room went silent. The only sound was the wind outside, pushing against the old barn wood. Alistair Finch, a man who had studied agricultural history for 30 years, felt something he couldn't quite name. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a story much larger than an old piece of farm equipment, a story about a man who decided, one autumn day, to lock away the very idea of asking for help and to prove that everything he needed was already there. This channel is for stories just like that. Stories about the quiet rebellions that changed the world, 1 acre at a time. The stories you won't find anywhere else. If you believe these stories need to be told, subscribe to this channel. Because what happened in that barn in 1958 changed not just one family, it changed the land itself. To understand the welded box, you have to go back. You have to understand the man who struck the arc. Arthur Hawthorne, born in 1925. He came of age in the shadow of the Great Depression. He learned the hard calculus of want. He served in the Pacific. He came home in 1946 with a quiet demeanor and a left sleeve pinned at the elbow. One arm. He never spoke of how he lost it. He just learned to do everything with his right. He learned to tie his boots. He learned to pitch hay. He learned to drive the Alice Chalmers his father had bought. He married a woman named Eleanor. They had a son. Life was hard, but it was their own. The farm was 160 acres, not large, but it was free and clear, a legacy from his grandfather, Samuel. Then came the drought of 1957. The sky turned to brass, the fields to dust, the corn withered on the stalk, the soybeans failed to pod. That year they made nothing, worse than nothing. They went into the winter with their savings gone. By the spring of 1958, they were desperate. The equipment was old. The tractor needed an engine rebuild. The planter was skipping seeds. Arthur knew he couldn't face another season like that. He needed an operating loan. Just enough to get new seed, fix the engine. Maybe, if he could, trade up for a newer planter. He put on his only suit. He drove his Ford pickup into town, to the County Trust and Savings Bank, a limestone building with a tall clock tower. He walked inside. The air was cool and smelled of paper and floor wax. He sat down across the wide oak desk of Frank Miller. Frank was the bank president. He was a pillar of the community. Deacon at the Presbyterian Church, coached the Little League team. He had a warm smile and kind eyes. He knew Arthur's father. He'd known Arthur since he was a boy. Frank poured him a cup of coffee. He listened patiently. He nodded in all the right places. Arthur laid it all out, the drought, the failed crop, the worn-out equipment. He explained his plan for the next season, a new crop rotation, a small investment in better seed. He needed $3,000, a modest sum even then. He slid his farm's deed across the desk as collateral. 160 acres, debt-free. Frank Miller stopped smiling. He tented his fingers. He looked at Arthur Hawthorne. He didn't look at him with judgment or with contempt. He looked at him with pity. It was a soft, gentle, corrosive thing. "Arthur," he said. His voice was kind. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen good farmers go under. I've seen families lose everything. Droughts come and go. But debt, son, debt stays." Arthur felt a cold knot in his stomach. This wasn't going the way he'd hoped. Frank continued, "You're a good man, a hard worker. Everyone in this town respects you. But farming is a tough business. It's getting tougher. The margins are thin. The big operations are buying up the small guys. It's a two-handed man's game, Arthur, and that's the hard truth of it." The words hung in the air. One arm. He didn't have to say it. Frank leaned forward. He pushed the deed back across the desk. "I'm not going to be the man who sets you up to fail. I'm not going to be the man who takes your family's land when you can't make the payments next year. It wouldn't be right. It wouldn't be kind." He picked up a piece of paper. "Now, I've had a conversation with John Vanderzee. He farms that section next to you. He's looking to expand. He's authorized me to make you an offer, a good offer, a fair price for your 160 acres, enough to set you up with a nice house in town, get a steady job at the mill, provide for Eleanor and the boy without all this worry." Arthur stared at the paper. He didn't touch it. He felt the blood drain from his face. Frank Miller wasn't being cruel. He wasn't being a villain. He genuinely believed he was helping. He was protecting Arthur from himself, from his own ambition, from the possibility of failure. He had looked at Arthur Hawthorne, and in his kind, decent, church-going heart, he had decided what Arthur was capable of. He had drawn a circle around Arthur's life and called it safety. Arthur stood up. His chair scraped on the polished floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He looked Frank Miller in the eye. "Thank you for the coffee, Frank." He said it so quietly Frank had to lean in. Then he turned and walked out of the bank. He left the offer sitting on the desk. He drove home under a vast, empty sky. He didn't feel anger. Not yet. He felt a hollowness. The quiet devastation of being told, "You can't." Not by an enemy, but by a friend. By someone who was absolutely certain they were doing the right thing. He pulled the truck into the farmyard. He sat there for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled. He watched the dust motes dance in the afternoon sun. He got out. He walked into the house. Eleanor was at the kitchen table, mending a pair of his son's overalls. She looked up. She saw his face. She knew. She didn't ask what happened. She just waited. Arthur sat down heavily in his chair. The silence in the kitchen was thick. Finally, he spoke. "He says I can't do it. He says I should sell. He thinks he's protecting me." Eleanor put down her sewing. She reached across the table and took his hand. His one good hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were clear. She did not offer sympathy. She did not offer comfort. She offered something harder, something more valuable. She offered belief. "Frank Miller runs a bank, Arthur. He doesn't run this farm. He knows numbers. He doesn't know the dirt." She squeezed his hand. "The land doesn't know how many arms you have. It only knows the work. Everything we need is already here, in our hands, in this soil." The words settled into him, not like a comfort, like a foundation. Everything we need is already here. He stood up. He walked out of the house and went to the barn. The sun was setting, casting long shadows. He pulled the Alice Chalmers out into the yard. He opened the toolbox. It held a few wrenches, a hammer, some spare spark plugs, the things you keep for when you break down, the things you need when you're far from home and need help. He took everything out. He laid the tools neatly on the ground. He went to his workshop. He came back with the welder. He struck an arc, a brilliant blue-white light that hissed in the twilight. He laid a bead along the seam of the toolbox lid, slowly, carefully, a perfect, permanent seal. Sparks showered down onto the dusty ground. His son, just a small boy, watched from the porch. He was closing a door. He was making a statement, not with words, with fire and steel. "We will not break down. We will not need help. We will not ask again. Everything we need is already here." He finished the weld. He turned off the machine. The metal glowed a dull cherry red in the gathering dark. He touched it with his gloved hand. Final. From that day on, the farm was an island. He started with the tractor engine. He couldn't afford new parts, so he made them. He spent nights in his workshop with a lathe and a forge. He machined a new piston sleeve from a piece of scrap steel. He retimed the magneto by ear. He learned the language of his machine, every knock, every tick, every vibration. He knew it like he knew his own body. He couldn't afford a new planter, so he rebuilt the old one. He re-engineered the seed plates. He calibrated them for a precise depth. A depth he learned not from a manual, but from years of walking his own fields, of crumbling the dirt in his hand. He couldn't afford fertilizer, so he changed the way he farmed. He started a complex system of cover cropping, planting clover and vetch in the fall, plowing it under in the spring, letting the green manure feed the soil. He built compost piles taller than he was. He returned every bit of organic matter to the land. He was creating a closed loop, a self-sufficient system. an act of defiance against a world that ran on credit. The first harvest, in the fall of 1959, was a modest success. He broke even. He paid his property taxes. He bought groceries for the winter. He had asked for nothing. He owed nothing. The feeling was better than any profit. It was the feeling of freedom. It was the feeling of being enough. Of course, the neighbors talked. They saw what he was doing. At the co-op, over coffee, they debated the Hawthorne farm. Some admired him. Old Man Hemlock, who'd seen the Dust Bowl, would nod. "The boy's got grit," he'd say. "He understands the land." But others were skeptical. They were modern farmers. They believed in progress, in bigger machines, in better chemicals, in leveraging debt to grow. John Vanderzee, the man who had made the offer on his land, shook his head. He's stubborn. He's proud. That pride is going to cost him everything. You can't farm like it's 1930 anymore. The world has moved on. He's turning his back on good advice. It's a shame to see. He'll lose it all within 5 years. They weren't being malicious. They were expressing the conventional wisdom, the logic of the system they all lived in. A system Arthur had quietly, decisively stepped out of. Have you ever done something that no one else understood? Have you ever been told you were making a mistake by people who were certain they knew better? People who thought they were protecting you from your own foolishness? Tell me about it in the comments below. Because this is where the story of Arthur Hawthorne becomes more than just the story of one man. It becomes the story of what is possible when you refuse to accept the limits other people place on you. The next few years were lean, but each year the soil got better. The yields crept up, a bushel per acre here, 2 bushels there. He kept his costs to almost nothing. While his neighbors were paying interest on their big new tractors, Arthur was in his shop, mending his own. While they were buying tons of chemical fertilizer, Arthur was spreading compost. He was running a different kind of math. The contrast was stark. By 1962, he had saved enough money. A small parcel of land came up for sale on his southern border. 40 acres of pasture, gone to seed. He went to the auction. He stood at the back. When the bidding was done, he was the owner. He paid for it in full, cash. He spent the next year clearing it by hand, one arm. He put it into alfalfa. By 1965, he was selling hay to the dairy farmers. Profit. In 1968, the farm on his western edge went bankrupt. The farmer had taken out too many loans on new equipment. A single bad year wiped him out. Arthur bought the 80 acres. Cash. Frank Miller at the bank signed the paperwork. He didn't say much. He just looked at Arthur with a strange expression, a mix of confusion and grudging respect. Arthur started raising a small herd of cattle. The manure went back into the fields. The loop grew stronger, more self-sufficient. 1970. His son was old enough to help. They worked side by side. The farm was a classroom. The lessons were about soil health, patience, and independence. The first lesson was always the same. You don't buy what you can't afford. You don't ask for what you can earn. Everything we need is already here. 1975. He bought another 120 acres. Cash. His farm was now 400 acres. All of it paid for. All of it productive. His yields were now consistently 20% higher than the county average. His input costs were 50% lower. The math was undeniable. John Vanderzee, his big modern neighbor, sometimes stopped his massive new John Deere combine at the edge of his property. He'd look over the fence at Arthur's fields. They were greener, healthier. He couldn't understand it. It defied all modern logic. Arthur was farming with a 30-year-old tractor and homemade tools, but his land was thriving. The quiet witness. Frank Miller would sometimes drive his Buick down the county road on a Sunday afternoon. He'd slow down as he passed the Hawthorne place. He'd see the new barn, built in '72. He'd see the healthy cattle in the pasture. He'd see the neat, clean fields. He never stopped. He just watched from a distance. Watched the man he had tried to save from failure become one of the most successful farmers in the region. He must have wondered. He must have replayed that conversation in his office over and over again. The certainty he had felt, the kindness he thought he was offering. He was watching the living proof of how wrong he had been. Let me tell you about the next 10 years. They were a blur of hard work and quiet accumulation. 1981, Arthur bought a neighboring 80 acres, cash. 1983, he bought a used but newer combine, a gleaner. He paid for it with one season's profit, cash. He was now farming nearly 500 acres, debt-free. Then came the 1980s farm crisis. Commodity prices collapsed, interest rates soared, land values plummeted. It was a perfect storm. Farmers who had leveraged themselves to the hilt were wiped out. Foreclosure signs sprouted like weeds along the county roads. John Vanderzee lost his farm. The bank took his big new equipment. The land he had spent a lifetime building was sold at auction. The system he had believed in had betrayed him. One afternoon in the fall of 1986, a car pulled into Arthur Hawthorne's driveway. It was Frank Miller. He looked old. The years had stooped his shoulders. His certainty was gone, replaced by a deep weariness. Arthur met him on the porch. They didn't shake hands. They just stood there for a moment. The autumn air was crisp. Frank spoke first. His voice was thin. Arthur, the bank is in trouble. We're carrying too much bad paper, too many foreclosures. The regulators are coming down on us. Arthur just listened. He didn't say a word. Frank looked out over Arthur's fields. The corn was harvested. The stubble was neat and golden. The cover crop of winter rye was already greening the soil, a picture of health, of stability. Frank cleared his throat. The old Hemlock place is going under. It borders your northern section. The bank has to sell it. We need to get it off our books before the end of the quarter. He finally looked at Arthur. I need you to buy it, Arthur. I know you have the capital. It would help the bank a great deal. It might save us. The irony was suffocating. The man who had refused Arthur a $3,000 loan to save his farm was now asking Arthur to spend 100 times that to save his bank. Arthur was silent for a long time. He looked at this man, this kind, decent man who had almost ruined him, not with malice, but with certainty, with the gentle, patronizing belief that he knew what was best for another man. Proving someone wrong who thinks they're being kind is the loneliest fight there is. When Arthur finally spoke, his voice was not triumphant. It was not angry. It was quiet, and it was devastating. Do you remember that day in your office, Frank, in 1958? Frank nodded slowly. His eyes were downcast. I remember. You told me I couldn't do it. You told me farming was a two-handed man's game. You offered to help me sell. You thought you were being kind. Arthur paused. He let the words settle. You were wrong, Frank. Not just about the farm. You were wrong about me. You spent the next 30 years watching me prove you wrong, and you never once stopped your car. You never once came to my door to say you made a mistake. Frank looked up. There were tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, Arthur. I was wrong. Arthur gave a slow, sad nod. I know you are. And I'll buy the Hemlock place. Not for you, not for your bank. For old man Hemlock. He was one of the few who believed in me. He bought the land, cash. He saved the bank. But something more important had been settled that day. A debt that had nothing to do with money had been acknowledged. A quiet, 30-year injustice had been named. Arthur Hawthorne never got any bigger. He had the land he could manage. The farm was a perfectly balanced system. He spent his later years not acquiring more, but refining what he had. He became a mentor. Young farmers, struggling to get started, would come to his door. He never turned them away. He didn't give them money. He gave them knowledge. He taught them about soil health, about crop rotation, about fixing their own equipment. He taught them the math that the banks didn't understand, the math of self-sufficiency. His son took over the day-to-day operations in the 1990s. He ran it on the same principles. No debt, no dependence. The land comes first. Arthur passed away in 2008. He was buried in the small churchyard overlooking his fields. The farm passed to his son, and then, eventually, to his granddaughter, Clara. Clara had her grandfather's quiet determination, but she also had a formal education. She went to the state university and got a degree in agronomy and soil science. She came back to the farm with new ideas: precision agriculture, no-till farming, advanced composting techniques. She didn't discard the old ways, she blended them with the new. She honored her grandfather's philosophy, but she used modern science to make it even more efficient, more resilient. The Hawthorne farm became a model, a beacon of sustainable agriculture in a sea of industrial farming. In 2015, Clara established the Hawthorne Foundation, funded entirely by the farm's profits. It gives a scholarship every year, a full ride to the agricultural college for a young person from a small town. It's not just about the money. The recipients spend a summer interning on the Hawthorne farm. They learn the philosophy. They learn the history. They stand in the barn and look at the old Alice Chalmers with its welded toolbox. They learn the story of a man who was told he wasn't enough, and who spent a lifetime proving that the person who told him that was wrong. That is the legacy, not the land, not the money, the ripple effect. The generations of young farmers who will start their careers not with debt, but with knowledge, with the core belief that everything they need is already there. Which brings us back to the barn. February of 2023, Dr. Alistair Finch has finished his inspection. He is packing his notes away. He looks one last time at the tractor. That toolbox, he says. It's the heart of the story, isn't it? Clara nods. I've never opened it. My father never opened it. My grandfather sealed it, and we respected that. But, she says, pulling an angle grinder from a workbench, I think it's time. She puts on a pair of safety glasses. She plugs in the grinder. The machine whines to life. The sound echoes in the big, cold barn. She touches the cutting wheel to the silver weld. Sparks fly. A brilliant orange waterfall against the faded paint. She moves slowly, carefully, tracing the line her grandfather made 65 years ago. The smell of hot metal fills the air. It takes a few minutes. The final piece of the weld gives way. She turns off the grinder. The silence rushes back in. She takes a small pry bar. She wedges it into the new cut. The lid groans. It resists. Then, with a final pop, it opens. It hasn't seen the light of day since 1958. Alistair Finch steps closer. Clara peers inside. The bottom of the box is clean, empty, except for two small things sitting in the center. The first is a piece of paper, folded into a small square. yellowed with age. Clara picks it up. Her hands are steady. She unfolds it carefully. It's a letter. On the letterhead of the County Trust and Savings Bank, dated April 14th, 1958. It is the formal denial of his $3,000 loan application, signed in neat cursive by Franklin Miller, President. The official record of the moment that changed everything. The catalyst, the wound, the thing he had to lock away to move forward. Beside it is the other object. It's a small bird, carved from a single piece of pine. Its wings are spread as if in mid-flight. The detail is exquisite, the work of a patient hand, a one-handed man sitting in his workshop during the long winter nights. Clara picks it up. It's light. She knows what it is. It was her grandfather's only hobby, his way of finding quiet in a loud world. She holds the letter in one hand, the bird in the other. The refusal and the response. The cage and the flight. Everything you need to know about Arthur Hawthorne was right there. In a toolbox he welded shut to remind himself of one simple, powerful truth. The most dangerous limitation is the one imposed by someone who genuinely believes they are protecting you. Certainty about another person's capabilities, delivered with kindness, is more damaging than outright hostility, because it cannot be fought with anger. It can only be disproven, with decades of work, with a quiet, relentless, unshakable belief in yourself. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is sitting in an office, being told what they are not capable of. Someone is being handed a kind, reasonable, logical explanation for why their dream is impossible. They are being protected from failure. If you are that person, this story is for you. If you know that person, share this story with them. The world is full of people who will tell you what you can't do. Don't be one of them, not even to yourself. Subscribe for more stories of quiet rebellion. And remember, sometimes the first step to building something new is welding a door shut.